Welcome to Deep Dive. Today we're really plunging headfirst into one of the most persistent and I think infuriating mysteries in modern business.
It really is.
We're asking the question, how do these CEOs, these leaders of massive, publicly scrutinized companies,
The crypto exchanges, the big fintech giants, the unicorns.
exactly, how do they reach a point where their actions, no matter how reckless or, overtly fraudulent, seem to have no immediate consequences? It's like they're surrounded by this invisible shield.
It's an exercise in structural hypocrisy, really.
Mm.
These people are held up as these singular geniuses, these visionaries.
Right.
And yet, the very systems that are supposed to ensure trust and accountability, their own boards, their auditors, the regulators, they all just become neutralized.
It's not just that they fail. It feels like they sometimes actively help create that impunity.
Yeah.
Right up until the moment the whole thing just collapses.
And it drags everyone down with it. Billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives.
And to really frame this, to get a sense of the scale of this paralysis, we have to start with a quote. It's the one that, for me at least, defined the whole FTX scandal.
Oh, I know the one you're talking about.
This comes from John J. Ray III. He's the new CEO brought in to clean up the mess left by Sam Bankman-Fried. And you have to remember, this is the guy who handled the Enron fallout.
So he's seen the worst of the worst.
He's seen the worst. And what he said about FTX is just, it's chilling. It really sets the tone for our entire deep dive today. He stated, and I'm quoting directly here, "Never in my career have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information as occurred here.
And then he adds the kicker.
This situation is unprecedented."
Worse than Enron. Just let that sink in for a moment. Enron was the poster child for complex, sophisticated corporate fraud.
Right.
And FTX, by his account, was just a chaotic, centralized mess run by a tiny inner circle.
So that quote, really, that's our mission statement today. We're going to unpack the structural, the psychological, and I think the cultural forces that build this untouchable shield.
We need to understand how a leader can operate so far outside the norms of accountability that the only thing that can possibly stop them is a total catastrophic implosion.
Okay, let's start by unpacking the facts of two of these collapses, FTX and Wirecard. They really emphasize how the CEO's centralized power was the root cause of all the deception. So, case one, FTX. This is, for me, the perfect illustration of the founder as absolute monarch.
He really is.
The failure here wasn't about some complex financial engineering. It was about basic elementary negligence.
FTX is the quintessential example of what happens when you combine vast amounts of customer money with a complete and total concentration of power.
SBF had absolute control.
Absolute. And John J. Ray III, the cleanup CEO, he described the management team as, and this is a quote, "a small group of grossly inexperienced and unsophisticated individuals."
And this is a company that, at its peak, was valued at what, over $30 billion?
North of $30 billion, handling the assets of millions of customers all over the world. And it was being run like a college dorm room.
The details of the operational failures are they're so stunningly basic, they almost sound fake. We are talking about a multi-billion-dollar global entity that was allegedly using QuickBooks for its finances.
QuickBooks.
I mean, QuickBooks, that's software for like a small business, a freelancer.
Right, for tracking your invoices, maybe payroll for 10 people, not reconciling billions of dollars in volatile crypto assets across dozens of countries.
It's mind-boggling.
And that's just the surface, The software choice was just a symptom. The real disease was the total absence of any basic internal controls.
Okay, so explain that. In crypto, your assets are on the blockchain, this digital ledger. What does an exchange need to do?
An exchange has to constantly, and I mean constantly, verify or reconcile that the assets it claims to hold for its customers actually match the assets it physically or digitally possesses.
And FTX.
The new leadership found that they had failed to maintain a proper reconciliation. There was no real-time, trustworthy audit trail.
So they didn't actually know what they held for their customers.
They were just operating a black box, which of course leads us directly to the core of the scheme.
Right. SBF founded his hedge fund, Alameda Research, first, back in 2017. Then FTX, the exchange, in 2019.
Supposedly separate entities, but in reality they were completely fused. Customer funds were treated like one big communal pot of money.
And this is where that concentration of power becomes fatally toxic.
Precisely. FTX gave Alameda Research these special, unprecedented privileges.
Like what?
Specifically, an unlimited line of credit, No collateral needed, no risk controls, nothing,
An unlimited line of credit.
which became absolutely critical in May of 2022.
When the whole Terra Luna ecosystem collapsed.
Exactly. That triggered this massive crypto price drop across the entire industry. Alameda, which was hugely leveraged, got hit hard. Its lenders started calling in billions of dollars in loans.
So SBF is facing this existential threat to his hedge fund, and he decides to use the one thing he controls completely.
FTX. The allegation is that he just told Alameda to draw even more from that unlimited FTX credit line to pay off its external debts.
So customer money.
FTX customer deposits. Money people had entrusted to the exchange for safekeeping, for trading, was allegedly just diverted, without their knowledge, to bail out his failing speculative trading firm.
The SEC said billions were diverted, turning Alameda into his personal treasury.
A personal piggy bank. And it wasn't just for covering trading losses either.
Right, the details that came out were insane. Luxury condos in the Bahamas.
High-profile political campaigns, huge private investments, all allegedly with customer funds.
And how do they hide all this?
Well, the operations were deliberately opaque. They commingled everything. Customers were sometimes told to deposit their money into bank accounts controlled by Alameda, not FTX.
So the line was blurred from the very beginning.
Completely. And here's the kicker. They allegedly used communication apps, both internal and external, that had an auto-delete function.
Auto-deleting messages.
Yeah.
About multi-billion-dollar transactions.
Exactly. It deliberately created an environment with no permanent record. It makes a real audit virtually impossible. The whole system wasn't just negligent, it was engineered for self-dealing and opacity.
It's just a dizzying display of what happens when a charismatic founder is allowed to just substitute his personality for actual corporate governance.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pivot now to case 2, which is Wirecard. This is different.
Very different.
Unlike FTX, this was a massive, established German fintech company, publicly traded on the DAX 30 index, a blue-chip stock.
Right.
And yet, it fell into what sources are calling an overvaluation trap.
Wirecard's collapse in 2020 was just spectacular. It exposed a 1.9 billion euro hole of fictitious cash on its balance sheet.
1.9 billion.
And it cemented its place as one of the biggest global accounting scandals ever. What's so fascinating here, and what makes it different from FTX's chaos, is the structural pressure that was on the CEO, Marcus Braun.
So explain this overvaluation trap. What does that mean?
Well, according to agency theory, when a company becomes severely overvalued, it creates a massive risk factor for fraud. Management basically has to keep manipulating the results just to justify the insane stock price.
And Wirecard was.
Hyper overvalued. The stock price shot up 5-fold in just 2 years. Its price-to-earnings ratio skyrocketed over 300%.
So Braun and his team were essentially backed into a corner.
They were forced into these increasingly desperate, manipulative accounting practices just to keep the whole facade from collapsing, just to justify that market valuation.
Okay, so let's get into the mechanics of their deception. This wasn't as simple as just moving money around internally.
No, this was geographically fragmented and highly elaborate. They manufactured fictitious revenue.
How much?
Investigations estimate nearly a third of their total revenue, and up to 80% of their profits were completely fake.
80% of profits.
Completely fabricated. They did it by generating these fake transactions in unregulated, unlicensed environments, mostly across Asia. They had this network of third-party acquirers in places like the Philippines, Singapore, Dubai.
And these third parties were processing transactions.
Supposedly. The commissions from these transactions were then supposedly routed through escrow accounts managed by independent trustees.
And this is where the infamous 1.9 billion euros comes in.
That was the ultimate phantom asset. The money was supposedly held in 2 specific trustee accounts in the Philippines. Wirecard management gave their auditors bank confirmation letters supposedly proving the funds existed.
But they were fake.
Completely fabricated. Forensic investigations later revealed the letters were forgeries, and the money simply did not exist. They were using falsified contracts, fake emails, everything they could to inflate the figures.
And just like FTX, the core enabler was the tone from the top. It was Marcus Braun and the COO, Jan Marsalek.
Yes, and their organizational design was, frankly, genius in its corruption.
How so?
They deliberately restricted their own employees. The assurance and risk teams inside Wirecard could only verify transactions for their specific geographic region.
So no one could see the whole picture.
No mid-level or even senior manager had access to the global internal data needed to connect the dots. Global data access was restricted to a tiny handful of senior managers, the inner sanctum. It made any kind of internal oversight functionally impossible.
Which brings us to the external failure. This, to me, is maybe the most shocking part of the whole Wirecard story.
The role of the regulator.
For years, investigative journalists, especially from the Financial Times, were flagging these issues. They had specific evidence. And the German regulator, BaFin,
Did nothing. Or worse than nothing. This is a textbook example of regulatory failure, maybe even what you'd call institutional capture.
they went after the journalist.
Instead of investigating the company based on these detailed allegations, BaFin was heavily criticized for actively investigating the short sellers and the reporters who were asking the hard questions.
And they banned short selling of Wirecard stock.
They did, which effectively signaled confidence in the company and protected its stock price. It just created this impermeable external shield that allowed Braun to keep his scheme going for years.
It's hard to imagine a clearer example of how auditors, regulators, and just systemic inertia can conspire, even unintentionally, to create total immunity for a CEO.
So those two cases, FTX and Wirecard, they really show us the consequences of that absolute operational control. But the question is, how do these founders legally, or at least semi-legally, bake that immunity into the corporate structure from day one?
Right, we're moving from the crime itself to the governance mechanism that allows the crime.
Exactly.
And the first, and maybe the most effective weapon in that arsenal is the dual-class stock structure.
It's the ultimate legal loophole for unchecked founder power.
And it's getting more and more popular, right?
Yeah.
Especially in tech.
It is. The core function is simple. It strategically decouples economic interests from voting control.
Okay, so break that down. When I buy a share of a public company, I'm getting two things.
Right. You get an economic interest, you own a piece of the company, but you also usually get voting power, which is proportional to your stake.
And dual-class stock messes with that balance.
It completely severs it. Founders and insiders hold, say, Class B shares. These shares have super voting rights, 10 times, 20 times, sometimes even more, the voting power of the standard Class A shares that get sold to the public.
So the public shareholders, who are putting up most of the money and taking most of the financial risk.
Yeah, their shares have limited or sometimes even no voting power. It legally neutralizes their ability to challenge or discipline management, no matter how big their collective financial stake gets.
And the poster child for the abuse of this structure has to be WeWork and Adam Neumann.
Oh, absolutely. Adam Neumann's entire reign of, well, excess, the bizarre self-dealing, the chaotic management, the absurd valuation, all of it was enabled by this structure,
He had the super voting shares.
which gave him total control. The board was functionally just an advisory committee. They couldn't fire him. They couldn't overrule him.
And his self-dealing was audacious, doesn't even begin to cover it.
It was legendary. I mean, the IPO prospectus revealed so many instances. They're almost comical if they weren't so financially destructive.
Like leasing his own properties back to the company.
Exactly. He personally owned buildings and then had WeWork, the company he ran, sign leases to be a tenant in his own buildings. It's a guaranteed stream of personal income at the company's expense.
And then there was the We trademark incident.
The notorious example. He personally owned the trademark for the word we and then sold it to his own company for nearly $6 million.
It's extracting value in plain sight.
And he was completely protected by the structural shield of his voting power. He could treat the company like his personal slush fund.
This creates what academics call agency costs. It's a term we hear a lot, but what does it mean in this context?
Agency costs are basically the losses that happen when the interests of the management, the agent, don't align with the interests of the shareholders, the principal.
And dual-class stock guarantees that misalignment.
It does. The founder holds all the power, the voting control, even if they sell off most of their financial stake, their economic ownership. This immunity means the founder is free to pursue their own interests, not the company's.
But there has to be a counter-argument, right? I mean, why do stock exchanges even allow this?
The argument from proponents is that it's necessary to protect a founder's idiosyncratic vision.
Run short-termism.
Right. From the pressure of Wall Street to hit quarterly earnings targets. The idea is that this would force a founder to make bad long-term decisions. So dual-class structures are supposed to give these visionary entrepreneurs a runway, maybe 7 to 10 years, to execute a big long-term strategy.
And there's some research that says these firms can actually outperform in the early years.
There is. In the early years post-IPO, they sometimes do. So it's a kind of high-risk, high-reward bargain. It can protect a true visionary, like the founders of Google,
But it can also protect a reckless actor like Adam Newman.
Exactly. Which brings us to the second major structural failure: board capture and a critical lack of expertise. And this takes us right back to Theranos.
The board is supposed to be the final guardrail, but it so often just becomes a group of cheerleaders.
Or hostages.
The Theranos board under Elizabeth Holmes it was an absolute joke from a
Right.
governance perspective. It was stacked with these huge names from politics and the military.
And that was a deliberate, egregious failure. The board had people like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, former secretaries of state, William Perry, former secretary of defense.
Huge names, massive credibility.
But they had zero relevant expertise, nothing in biotech, lab work, medical diagnostics. They weren't there for scrutiny. They were there to provide a halo effect.
That halo effect.
Yeah.
So the positive impression from one area, like their political stature, makes everyone assume that their technical and ethical standards must be equally high.
Precisely. It creates this immediate, unquestioning shield around the CEO, and anyone who tried to pierce that shield internally at Theranos was systematically eliminated.
Right, I remember the stories.
An Apple veteran, Avi Tavanian, was forced to resign for just challenging Holmes's financial projections, which were obviously absurd. The former CFO was fired for asking detailed questions about whether the equipment actually worked.
And all of this was compounded by the fact that Holmes herself held something like 99.7% of the voting shares.
So professional skepticism was literally impossible. She had total control.
When a leader says they're building a religion, which she reportedly did, asking a critical question isn't due diligence anymore.
It's treated as a moral failure, an act of treason against the mission.
So the structural takeaway is pretty clear. You give a founder bulletproof voting control, and then you surround them with directors who lack the technical expertise or the independence to challenge them.
You have legally manufactured an untouchable CEO, perfectly insulated from reality.
So we've laid out the external structures, the legal shields. Now let's go a bit deeper into the internal shifts. What happens inside the mind of a leader when success becomes absolute power and they realize they are, for our practical purposes, untouchable?
The psychological shift it's profound, and it's especially acute for these successful startup founders. They go through something you could call transition shock.
With that,
They have to move from being this lone wolf entrepreneur, the visionary who does everything themselves, to leading a huge, complex organization with thousands of employees and, public accountability.
so the very traits that made them successful in the beginning.
Exactly. The hyper-focus, the aggressive, impulsive action, the belief that they can override any normal process, those things suddenly become massive liabilities when they're in the governance phase.
They have to shift from their own goals to what the organization needs.
Right. And when that balance fails, we get into the territory of extreme overconfidence, which sources directly linked to systemic financial risk.
Is there actual research that tracks that shift from just healthy confidence to, a systemic recklessness?
There is. It's addressed by what's known as the upper echelons theory.
Okay.
The theory basically says that in organizations where the CEO has broad, unchecked power, their own personal behavioral biases, like extreme overconfidence, become the main drivers of the company's strategy and its risk profile.
Can you give an example of how that overconfidence translates into real, measurable corporate risk?
Sure. Overconfident executives, especially in finance, are statistically way more likely to engage in risky behavior. They overestimate their loan projections, future cash flows.
So they underprepare for downturns.
They reduce essential loan loss provisions, which exposes the whole balance sheet to much bigger shocks. And they also relentlessly pursue what research often calls value-destroying mergers.
They think they can make any acquisition work.
They believe they have some superior vision, that they can unlock synergies no one else sees. So they overpay, sometimes massively, for acquisitions, destroying shareholder value, all based on a profound belief in their own unique genius.
So this personal bias, when it's at the head of a huge institution, doesn't just hurt that one company. It starts contributing to risk for the entire system.
It's an accelerant. And this kind of concentrated power has a strong psychological correlation with the traits known as the dark triad.
Narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism.
Right. And it's important to see how these traits manifest in a corporate setting. It's not just about being a difficult boss.
But how do they play out?
Well, narcissism is that profound need for adoration, the belief in their own infallibility. A narcissistic CEO can't tolerate being contradicted. Anyone who points out a flaw is seen as a threat and is pushed out. That's Theranos in a nutshell.
Silencing dissent.
Exactly. Then you have Machiavellianism. That's the strategic, manipulative part. These CEOs are experts at designing organizations to concentrate control and obscure information, just like Marcus Braun did at Wirecard, centralizing all the global data.
They use deceit to achieve their goals.
hmm And finally, you have psychopathic traits. This is rare in the clinical sense, but traits like a lack of empathy or ethical concern that allows a leader to commit large-scale financial fraud without any internal moral conflict.
They can see customer funds or employee livelihoods as just tools.
Just means to an end. It enables the kind of ruthless commingling of billions that we saw alleged at FTX.
And this combination, it must create a culture of what cognitive dissonance in the inner circle.
A self-reinforcing echo chamber. Everyone starts accepting only the evidence that confirms what the leader wants to be true. Confirmation bias runs rampant.
You stop asking, is this true?
And you start asking, how do we make this look true?
This connects to something I found really fascinating, the authenticity paradox. We're always told leaders should be authentic, but some sources suggest that's actually part of the problem.
This is such a critical nuance. When powerful people focus too much on being true to themselves, on acting impulsively based on their own needs and desires, especially when they're stressed, that impulsivity is often what leads directly to misconduct.
So the effective leader isn't the one who just acts on their gut feeling, even if that feels authentic.
No. The research suggests effective leadership actually requires doing what is necessary for others, ensuring the team feels safe, that they know the direction, that they trust the person at the helm.
Even if that means suppressing your own anxiety or playing a role that feels a bit inauthentic in the moment.
Exactly. True responsibility means serving the needs of your stakeholders, not indulging the needs of your own ego. It completely flips the conventional wisdom on its head.
Okay, this next section raises I find it a truly disturbing question about the priorities of corporate America. If the main goal of corporate governance is to protect long-term shareholder value, why do boards seem to prioritize punishing one kind of misconduct over another, and often with completely contradictory results?
This is where the data reveals a massive blind spot. There's research that has analyzed hundreds of CEO scandals, and the findings are they're astonishing.
It's what you call the firing paradox.
Exactly. Boards are far, far swifter and more severe when they punish personal misconduct than they are when they punish massive economic financial fraud.
Let's look at the numbers here because they're pretty stark.
The statistics are clear. CEOs who commit personal indiscretions, we're talking affairs, drug abuse, public embarrassment, are 5 times more likely to be terminated than those implicated in core financial misconduct, like cooking the books.
Wait, say that again. 5 times more likely to be fired for an affair than for manipulating a balance sheet.
That is the chilling implication of the data.
Wow.
Personal scandals are often career-ending, and it's instantaneous. It doesn't matter how well the company is doing.
You're thinking of someone like Mark Hurd at HP.
The perfect example. He was widely credited with this huge, successful turnaround, but he was ousted almost immediately after a high-profile personal scandal came to light.
And the market reacted instantly. The stock dropped.
Because personal misconduct is seen as immediate, it's salient, it's newsy, and it's seen as reflecting fundamentally bad judgment that could bleed into business decisions.
Okay, but if financial fraud is the thing that demonstrably causes long-term economic destruction and systemic risk, why is the survival rate for those CEOs so high?
It's nearly 50%. Roughly half of CEOs implicated in serious financial scandals survive.
How?
Because financial misconduct can often be framed internally as a systemic technical error.
So it's a systems problem, not a people problem.
Exactly. The CEO can manage the optics. They can shift the blame to other executives, usually the CFO or the audit committee. It becomes this internal, fixable problem. And this allows the board to protect the public image of the CEO as the singular visionary while they quietly clean up the mess.
So even if the financial fraud caused 10 times more damage to investors, the board will consistently prioritize protecting the brand's image over pursuing full economic accountability.
It really speaks volumes about the priorities, doesn't it? Financial issues are complex, they take a long time to investigate, they can be negotiated away or blamed on bad market conditions.
Sure. But personal misconduct is simple. It's clear-cut.
And it immediately damages the brand's moral standing. The board's quick reaction in those cases is often a defensive move to minimize immediate reputational damage and stock volatility.
So the implication is that corporate America is vastly overestimating the importance of a CEO's private life.
While underestimating the profound long-term destruction caused by financial fraud.
So the path to staying untouchable, even if you're financially reckless, is just to make sure your personal life is squeaky clean.
Or at least undiscovered. Image management is valued over economic integrity. It makes financial recklessness a calculated risk, while a personal lapse is an immediate, unrecoverable failure. And of course, the CEO might be the orchestrator, but that shield of untouchability, it requires the systemic failure or the active complicity of all the external gatekeepers.
The auditors, the media, and the regulators.
Exactly.
Let's start with the auditors. They're supposed to be the market's primary line of defense, but they seem to be involved in almost every single one of these collapses. The Wirecard case with EY is just chilling.
The EY Wirecard failure is a textbook example of neglecting what's called professional skepticism. EY failed, fundamentally, in its duty to the public interest.
How? They just trusted what they were told.
They relied heavily on management representations. They basically trusted what Braun and Marsalek told them, and they ignored massive, glaring red flags, years of public whistleblower reports, detailed investigative journalism.
And what about the specific procedures around that phantom $1.9 billion?
They just failed to perform basic substantive testing. They accepted these confirmation letters for the money, supposedly in the Philippines, at face value.
When they should have been checking themselves.
A fundamental requirement of auditing is independent verification. They should have called the banks directly. Instead, they relied on documents provided by the company, which turned out to be forgeries.
So the ethical issue is pretty clear.
It appears they prioritized client retention, keeping the enormous fees Wirecard paid them over their legal duty to the public.
Which gets to that chronic audit expectation gap. The public thinks an audit is a guarantee against fraud.
But the auditors are operating on a much lower threshold, relying heavily on what management tells them. And this pattern isn't isolated. We saw similar failures at Lehman Brothers with KPMG, at Carillion, at Satyam. The whole incentive structure rewards complacency, not scrutiny.
Okay, so then let's turn to the media. The media often helps build that initial shield through this cult of personality.
Oh, the media's role in creating the halo effect is huge. It can't be overstated.
When a founder like Elizabeth Holmes is on the cover of Fortune and Time.
And she's being explicitly compared to Steve Jobs and Bill Gates.
Right.
She had this unique status of being a business celebrity. And that positive media narrative validates her vision. It validates the stock price. And it leads everyone, stakeholders, employees, investors, to just assume that her competence and her ethical standards must be equally high, regardless of any evidence.
And that hero narrative makes it almost socially unacceptable to challenge them.
Exactly. Challenging the visionary starts to feel like an act of cynicism or even heresy.
When Holmes told her staff she was building a religion and they should leave if they didn't believe.
She was leveraging that cult-like atmosphere. The worship of the singular genius actively discourages critical, upward communication. If you express skepticism, you're not a diligent employee. You're a non-believer, a negative thinker.
Finally, you have the regulators, the ultimate enforcers. But the evidence shows these chronic gaps and fragmentation that fraudsters just love to exploit.
The Lehman Brothers collapse showed how regulators like the SEC failed to proactively regulate complex financial engineering, like off-balance sheet accounting. In the modern era, the problem has just gotten worse because of the speed of new industries.
Wirecard was able to exploit those jurisdictional loopholes. Its fake revenue was generated in places that were largely unregulated.
And the regulators themselves were fragmented. German regulators looked at Wirecard's traditional finance business separately from its new tech divisions, so they missed the big picture.
And FTX is the ultimate example of that.
An extreme challenge. Regulating a global new digital asset class where jurisdictional clarity it didn't exist. An exchange could be based in a jurisdiction with lax laws while serving customers everywhere. The system just wasn't built for that speed and fragmentation, and it allowed fraud to reach systemic scale before anyone could even agree on who was supposed to be watching.
So we've established that this untouchable CEO isn't a fluke. It's a failure of structural design, psychological bias, and systemic complacency. So where do we go from here? What are the structural changes we need to actually dismantle that shield?
Well, we have to start by addressing the massive expansion of executive pay inequality. We know that fundamentally incentivizes short-term, reckless behavior.
The CEO to worker pay ratio has just exploded.
It's gone from around 20 to 1 in the mid-20th century to well over 300 to 1 today.
And that compensation, it's not just big. It's often completely disconnected from actual long-term value.
It's often just a reward for luck, or for manipulating quarterly data to hit a temporary bonus target. This fuels that executive hubris we talked about and incentivizes high-risk behavior.
And we are starting to see some interesting responses to this, right?
Yeah.
Like that pay ratio surtax in Portland, Oregon.
It's a fascinating market-based attempt to demand accountability. The focus has to shift to aligning pay with long-term sustainable performance, not just transient profits that can be easily faked.
Okay, so that's compensation. What about governance? We have to tackle that dual-class stock problem head-on.
The single most critical reform here is the mandatory adoption of sunset clauses.
Okay, explain what those are.
They're provisions that say the superior voting rights have to automatically expire after a set period of time or when a specific event happens.
So the founder gets that runway they always argue they need, that 7 to 10 years of protected vision.
But the company is guaranteed to eventually revert to the democratic standard of one share, one vote. It institutionalizes accountability over the long term.
And you mentioned time-based and event-based sunsets.
Right. Time-based is the most common proposal, usually 7 to 10 years post-IPO. But event-based sunsets are also crucial. They could be triggered if the founder sells off a certain percentage of their financial stake.
So you can't have a founder sell 90% of their shares, but still keep 90% of the voting power.
Exactly. It keeps voting power aligned with economic risk.
That makes perfect sense. But what about the boards themselves? A sunset clause doesn't fix a board like the one at Theranos.
No, it doesn't. We need enhanced board diligence that emphasizes technical and sector-specific expertise over just political connections. Boards have to move beyond just passive stewardship toward what some call active, tense collaboration with the CEO.
And the audit committee specifically has to be technically savvy.
Absolutely. The people on that committee have to have the deep expertise to actually vet the CEO's claims, especially in complex fields like biotech or crypto.
Okay, and finally, we have to use technology to monitor the system itself.
The Wirecard and FTX cases just underline the urgent need for global regulatory coordination and tech-driven oversight. We can't rely on manual review of paper trails anymore.
So using things like AI to track financial irregularities in real time.
Exactly. Flagging anomalies, tracking cross-border transactions. It helps bridge that audit expectation gap by giving regulators and auditors the tools to see fraud before it becomes systemic. And international coordination is non-negotiable. Fraudsters thrive in those jurisdictional loopholes.
You mentioned sunset clauses, which seems like the most elegant structural solution. But what's the counter-critique? Do critics argue that it forces value destruction just as a founder is hitting their peak?
That's the core tension, right? Critics argue that forcing a sunset after, say, 7 years compels the founder to change their vision right when the company might be reaching maximum innovation. They say it can lead to the very short-termism it was meant to prevent. So finding that perfect balance is still the challenge.
So when you look back across all these cases, SBF, Marcus Braun, Adam Newman, Elizabeth Holmes, the conclusion feels profoundly consistent. The Untouchable CEO is not the result of some singular genius operating in a vacuum.
No, it's a calculated failure of these interlocking systems, voting structures that are deliberately anti-democratic.
Boards that prioritize political prestige over actual skepticism.
Media that builds these superhero narratives and complacent regulators that are fragmented and captured.
Accountability is never an accident. It is always a structural choice.
Always. It has to be written into the charter, reflected in the board composition, and enforced with technological rigor. When you systematically dismantle those pillars, when you prioritize hype and ego over due diligence, you make a collapse like this not just possible, but tragically predictable.
The path to sustainable corporate success, then, requires us to stop worshiping the singular visionary. It requires cultivating a corporate culture where critical upward communication and professional dissent aren't seen as treason, but as essential functions that should be rewarded.
The most resilient leaders are the ones who empower their teams to challenge them, who allow themselves to be vulnerable, not the ones playing the role of the all-knowing monarch.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to carry with you this week.
In your own professional life, what structures or cultural norms are you inadvertently tolerating that empower ego over ethics? Where is your own organization prioritizing performance based on a halo effect? And who are the indispensable voices, the skeptics, the critics, that you might be inadvertently silencing because their honesty just feels inconvenient? Think about where your own organizational architecture is lacking the accountability it needs to protect itself from the inevitable gravity of unchecked power.